And we continue in our verse-by-verse study through the book of Numbers. If you'd make your way to the book of Numbers, and as you know, this Old Testament narrative records the pilgrimage of Israel having just been liberated from Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea and camped out by Mount Sinai for a little over a year, heading toward the Promised Land. Chapters 1 through 10, which we've completed, indicate that everything was wonderful. The tabernacle was constructed. The people were getting right in line, doing exactly what God through Moses told them to do so happily as well, and trusting him, and everything was coming up roses, as it were. And then chapter 11 hit, and the people became complainers, obstinate, and the like. And we saw that in chapter 11. Today, we continue the historical narrative, picking up to chapter 12 in the book of Numbers. And we see the spirit of complaining had contaminated even the highest of leaders, that is, of Miriam and Aaron, the siblings of Moses. And so let's look at chapter 12, not a lengthy chapter, just 16 verses for this historical narrative about interpersonal relationships and the glory of biblical interpersonal relationships. How it ought to be, we kind of see the contrast here in this chapter. Numbers chapter 12. And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. Now, parenthetically, this was not his first wife. Almost certainly, this is not referencing Zipporah. Is that her name? I failed to research that. She had almost certainly already passed on. And in his travels, he married another woman. And if it would have been his first wife, it would have been a strange time for them to be complaining about her, because he'd been married to her for a long time. And now they're just starting to complain. So probably, Kathy, this is a new wife. And folks have a tendency to complain about the new wife. So just wanted to give you that. Who is this woman? Well, they had blamed her for their discontent, but you'll find out right away that wasn't their problem. That wasn't Miriam and Aaron's problem. Verse 2. And they said, hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men who were upon the face of the earth. And the Lord spoke suddenly unto Moses, and unto Aaron, and unto Miriam, come out, you three, unto the tabernacle of the congregation. And they three came out. They went over to the tabernacle where God was going to meet with them. And the Lord came down in the pillar of the cloud, and stood in the door of the tabernacle, and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. And he said, hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all my house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth, even plainly, and not in dark speeches, and the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Wherefore then, that is the veiled presence, the foggy presence of the Lord. You can't see God and live. But Moses was allowed to see the veil. He was covered in the hollow of the rock, you'll remember. That I'm going to allow for Moses. Wherefore then, were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? How dare you, is in essence what God is saying. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And the cloud departed from off the tabernacle. And behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. She was struck with leprosy. And Aaron said unto Moses, alas, my Lord, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and wherein we have sinned. Let her not be as one who is dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed when he cometh out of his mother's womb. And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, Heal her now, O God, I beseech thee. And the Lord said unto Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed 7 days? In other words, wouldn't she be ashamed if her own dad had spat upon her? Well, if that's the case, the answer is the rhetorical question, yes, she would be. This is way worse than that, is what God is saying. Let her be shut out from the camp 7 days. Exclude her. And after that, let her be received in again. And Miriam was shut out from the camp 7 days. And the people journeyed not till Miriam was brought in again. And afterward the people removed from Hazeroth and encamped in the wilderness of Paran. The problem in this chapter, which is as obvious as anything, is as old as time. Soon after Adam's family was removed from the Garden of Eden, we see that there was contention. We see that the glory of biblical interpersonal relationships had taken a left turn. And in fact, Cain killed Abel. There was family division that had not been present in the garden. And it was present then, and folks, it is ubiquitous in our day. Husbands and wives warring with each other, parents and children, neighbors, in the church, in the workplace, everywhere. Wars and rumors of wars, that's speaking about end times nationally, but it is going on interpersonally and has been going on interpersonally ever since the fall in the garden. And yet we see in Scripture the glory of biblical interpersonal relationships when we do live together in the way that God has prescribed. And so, 2 primary points, if you're taking notes, I want to point out some principles from this biblical narrative. What do we see, which is obvious to see? And I want to offer 4. Maybe there are more, but they're certainly, if not implicitly stated, they're explicitly laid out. And I want to remind us all that the Word of God tells us much about how we should live together interpersonally. And I know these principles and I believe them. I don't always practice them. With God as my witness, I want to make a difference in how I relate to you and how I relate to the world. I actually want to make a difference for the cause of Christ, for the glory of God. I don't always do so, and it's good to be reminded of the glory of biblical interpersonal relationships. And so I want to offer these principles, and they can and ought to apply really in every interpersonal relationship, family, friends, co-workers, church life, and the like. You can apply them. And really these principles that are going to be offered, I'm using the negative because we see a lot of negative in this chapter to demonstrate what ought to be. First of all, there's going to be a problem, and there was, when comparisons give rise to jealousy. And we see that very clearly with Miriam and Aaron complaining, saying that this ought not be, we're important as well, and the like. And you'll notice that Miriam seemed to be the one who was in charge here. She was the firstborn. Aaron was younger. Aaron was about 3 years older than Moses. We don't know how much older Miriam was, but likely a number of years older. So maybe we'll just say that she was 10 years old, and Aaron was at the time when Moses was born, and Aaron was 3 or so years older. So Miriam took the lead, and we see her name listed first, as well as in this passage when it talks about that she brought this complaint in chapter 12, spoke against. It's in the feminine. It's a feminine word, which gives more indication that really Miriam was the one who was spearheading this. Aaron was culpable. He had responsibility, but she seemed to be really the one that was causing problems. Now, it could be argued he should have stood up to her and said, no, this is not what we're all about. But he went along, as it were, for the ride. But comparisons will give rise to jealousy. And it's that theme in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, of ungratefulness. Well, why would somebody be ungrateful? Well, when I compare what I have with what you have, I have a tendency to think, I ought to be blessed in that way. I ought to be able to sing like Garrett. I ought to be able to teach a class like so-and-so. I ought to be able to have that same salary increase. And I ought to have this number of children and behaving perfectly like yours do and the like. And so when we start comparing ourselves with one, and folks, God has never promised that he's doled out the cookies in the same quantity, in the same shape, in the same flavor. In fact, we know it's exactly the opposite of that. There is an infinite, as it were, number of varieties and gifts and talents and opportunities. Not all of us share the same physical health. Not all of us have the same mental acuity and opportunities in life. We know that. But when we start comparing ourselves with one another, it gives rise to jealousy. I should have that. And what's more, because I don't have that, I don't want you to have that either. Wow, we see that green envy rising up in Miriam and in Aaron. And the text tells us Moses was meek. Moses was humble. Moses was not strutting his stuff at all. And yet they still reacted that way because God was speaking to him mouth to mouth, it says in the text, and he didn't do that with anyone else up to that point. And so comparisons gave rise to jealousy, and jealousy gave rise to disloyalty. Okay, now they're not just jealous, now they're turning their backs. And jealousy is that cruel taskmaster, because when you find someone who has it better off than you, that'll motivate you to look for something bad in that other person. That'll motivate you to be an inspector of that other person. Well, look at him. Look who he married. Look at his wife. And it's just simply motivated by that jealous heart. And now you turn disloyal. And it happens with even those who are closest to you. And folks, jealousy, you think, well, I would never do that. I would never. If I was in that situation, I would never turn on God's man like Moses. Well, jealousy has a wide continuum. That is from mild annoyance, just mildly annoying, like I've sensed I am for some of you, not very often, but it's happened. And I'm actually being truthful in that way, and I know that. Betsy, do I dare tell him what your mom told me 2 months into marriage? Vic, you would get on Jesus' nerves. So it can go from that's a quote. I didn't like the theology because I don't think you can get on Jesus' nerves. But I got the message. You can go from mild annoyance to murderous rage, Cain and Abel, because of jealousy. And you become disloyal when that happens. The motivating thrust then is being self-absorbed. I want that, and I don't want you to have it, and now I'm turning against you. James Stalker, who wrote the book, The Greatest Vices and Greatest Virtues of a Believer. Do I have that up there, guys? I think I do. Yeah, there it is. Wrote, there's something extraordinarily mean in the spirit which is unhappy and disappointed because of another person succeeding while it glories in another's misfortune. Miriam and Aaron had drank that Kool-Aid, and they had become disloyal. And what is especially dumbfounding in this is that Exodus 15:20 says that Miriam was a prophetess. And this passage reminds us that, or this book, that Aaron was the high priest. These are high-profile positions. I mean, these are cabinet-level positions, as it were. And yet, they made the excuse that Moses married a woman he ought not to have, therefore we're going to turn against him, when in reality, it was because he was in the limelight and they were not. Wow, what disloyalty. Well, what happens? Disloyalty gives rise, and gave rise in this context, to rebellion. a leader like Moses had to shepherd thousands of people in the wilderness. And Miriam and Aaron had better access to him than everyone else. And they spoke out against he being God's man. Now, let me pull over and park just for a moment here. This is an important teaching point. And I truly sought to do this as my children, my four stepping stones right in a row, 4 in a row, were growing up. And it's this. And parents, I think you would be wise in doing the same. Train your children to highly esteem authority. To highly esteem authority, no matter what the situation is. Whether it's the police, whether it's a political, someone who holds a political office, whether it is in the home, whether it is in the church, whatever it might be. You know, I knew when I got home from school not to tattle on my teacher and to sick my parents on the teacher, because if I told my parents what had happened to me at school, what would happen to me at home? Much worse. Much worse. You deserve that, Vic, and more. They never took my side, and I knew that they never took my side. And so they didn't feed that rebellion into me. But if you belittle God's man, as Miriam and Aaron did, and I have not been pleased, as many of you know, and it's not about me, but just by way of anecdote, I haven't been pleased going to the presidential polls in, I don't even, 20 years. Either side, either candidate, it's not been my person really across the board. Now, I've gone and I voted every time, but you'll never catch me demeaning that person. I'll argue about the policy, but not demean the person. At least I purpose not to do that. I place high esteem on God-ordained authority because He is the... Could God remove a king, a president, an emperor out of that place in a moment? Yes. God doesn't need me to do that. He's perfectly able to cause kings to rise up and to be put down. So Miriam and Aaron were out of place. They were rebelling from their disloyalty. And then, inevitably, rebellion is going to cause discipline to come. Discipline's going to come, and we see that. And the Lord heard it. Wow. That phrase is pregnant with dread. Uh-oh, God heard us going after His servant. God said it was like a father spitting in the face of his daughter because she disgraced the family. So too, Miriam, you have disgraced God's people in your rebellion. And again, Aaron, because it seems like he was just a wimp that went along with it, not the one that was causing it. And so there are some principles from this passage that we can see about how not to do interpersonal relationships, which are not the glory that God has for us in our relating to one another. Now, very quickly, some practices of the biblical norm of what it ought to look like. What does God say about interpersonal relationships in marriage, in the family, in the workplace, in the church? I'd offer that if Miriam and Aaron had understood these ideals, then chapter 12 would not have even come about, but they failed to do what really is timeless characteristics that ought to flavor every interpersonal relationship. And by the way, these practices that I'm going to mention are not character traits. They are spiritual disciplines that we are to believe, obey, actually do in our lives. I like what, speaking of the meekness of Moses, I like what commentator Marsing wrote. He says, such meekness is not so much a character trait as it is a faith posture. It explains why Moses did not defend himself against the complaints. He didn't try to defend himself because by faith he had committed himself to God using him. He didn't want to. He was reluctant, wasn't it? I can't go, they're not going to listen to me. Who do I tell them sent me? Tell them I am. I am's in charge. Okay. Well, I don't speak very well. I'll send Aaron along with you. Okay, here I go. Just this rod? That's what you're saying? Yeah, I'll do all kinds of things through that. Just avail yourself. And he did. So Moses was not a glory hog. He wasn't looking for that. But he did obey the Lord. Let me offer 4 ways in which we're to practice the glory of biblical interpersonal relationships. First of all, love one another. Love one another. It's the new commandment, the great commandment, John 13:34, that you love one another. As I have loved you, even so love one another. The love, it's putting someone else ahead of yourself. It's in the husband-wife relationship. I so love my spouse that I'm going to I'm going to chase down the opportunity to put him or her ahead of me in this and that and the other way. And there's just a myriad of ways this can play out. And what that does, if it's true biblical love from the heart, that sanctifies, that flavors the entire home life. Now, transfer that to the workplace, to the classroom, to the campus, to church life. And if I will love like Jesus loved, like I am to love, like I've loved you, he said, so you love one another. It's going to be an example of the glory of biblical interpersonal relationships. Love one another. 1 Peter 4:8 says much the same thing. And above all these things, whatever else I've said, have fervent, boiling love among yourselves, for love shall cover the multitude of sins. He's not lovely. She's not nice to me. She's unkind. But love is what? Boiling love is what will cover a multitude of sins. And folks, love is not a feeling. It's not an emotion. It's a verb. It's an action. I'm to move out and express selflessness to others and touch them with the touch of Jesus. So love one another. And Ephesians 4:31-32 says, be kind one to another. If I'll be kind to others, in this way let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. And you'll see in these verses the writer of Scripture, but Spirit of God inspiring, comparing, juxtaposing what Christ did, who Christ is, with who we are to be. And just like he has been kind to us and forgiven us and is tender toward us, so I'm to be in my interpersonal relationships. Is there anyone in your life that it feels like you have imagine, picture this. You're on the baseball or softball diamond. I'm going to a lot of exciting baseball games these days. The grandsons are just coming into being, they're budding major leaguers, if I have to say so. And you slide into home, and you do so on your hip, but you don't do it just perfectly. And you get this road rash on your leg. And it is fiery hot. Now, take a 60 grade coarse piece of sandpaper. Not your 220 grade, but your 60. Y'all with me? And you just rub it on. Is there anyone like that in your life? That's how it feels? What are you to do about that person when the glory of biblical interpersonal relationships is not all that fresh? You don't run away and avoid, not if you're going to have biblical. You run to, you run at with kindness, tenderness, and forgiveness. Wow. That's heaven on earth. That person is seeing Jesus walk around, as it were, compared to what the world would do. Love one another. Be kind to one another. Forgive one another. Again, as Christ hath forgave you, holy and beloved, as elect of God, put on hearts of mercy, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing, that is, being patient, forgiving. If you have a quarrel against another, even if he or she won't be that way, still you be that way, because Christ has forgiven you, so also do ye. And then accepting one another. Romans 15:7. He said, it doesn't use the word accept. Wherefore receive you one another as Christ also received us to the glory of God. Now let me offer something. These two words, receive here, and again comparing us to what Christ has done, is the normal word for reception, something that comes at you and you haul it in. I've been told in football that there's a such thing as throwing a pass, and there's a pass catcher who's called a receiver. And
your mic is off.
my mic is off. Hello? Can you hear me? Not me. I'll use this. I don't know what, I guess I went out. There, yeah, I did go out. I'm going to turn this mic off and use this. Are we good? Zerubbabel? Mark calls him Chauncey. I call him Zerubbabel. And so this word receive, stay with me, in Romans 15:7, is the normal word for that, but it has a prefix which intensifies it, and it means receive by virtue of that item drawing toward. And so at salvation, not only did the Lord Jesus receive you, he drew you toward himself in that reception. You with me? You didn't just happen along and fall into his lap. He lassoed you and was drawing you toward himself. And so too are we to be like that in drawing others toward, not holding at arm's length. She's hurt me in the past. He's not my friend. They're not my crowd. I don't want to get near that guy under the bridge. And you give any number of scenarios. But instead, you draw toward, you accept. Because as a woefully imperfect sinner, the Lord of glory drew you toward himself in accepting you. So what are we to do about this? If you too are in the shoes of Moses, you're walking in his sandals, you're being unrighteously hassled and hurt and humiliated and hunted down and hated by those who think they have a cause. Well, we're given the answer in 1 Peter 2, 19 to 23. And I'm done with this. 1 Peter 2, 19 to 23. For this is thankworthy. You can give thanks for this. If a man for conscience toward God, I'm just trying to serve the Lord, Moses said. If he endures grief, suffering wrongfully, for what glory is it if, when you're buffeted for your faults, you take it patiently? What glory is that? But if you do well and suffer for it, you take it patiently. This is acceptable with God. For even hereunto were you called. Again, comparing us with what Christ did. This is what Jesus did. He suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow his steps. Who did no sin, neither was guile, deceit, found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not. What did he do? he committed himself unto him, his Father, who, and you could say who alone, judges righteously. And so when folks come after you, if you want to, and I trust that you do, glorify the Lord in and through that situation, if you want to maintain and practice the glory of the biblical interpersonal relationship, love that person, be kind to that person, forgive him, and not just tolerate, but actually draw to your heart, accept in the way that Christ has done for you. And you'll see glory, his presence, flooding that whole arena of relationships. Lord, I'm thankful for this, your word, the narrative that we see, a lot of jealousy with Miriam and Aaron. And yet we see your mercy. We see a perfect parent, just discipline, measured discipline, and then mercy in Miriam being restored and used of you throughout her days. And so, Lord, if there is among us a fracture, a disruption with an interpersonal relationship, family member, co-worker, church member, would you do the deep work of conviction as only you can? I can't know. And maybe even there are those here who are self-deceived. Spirit of God, would you do that deep work of conviction? Plow that soil, that hardened soil, and dig it up and turn it over so that there can be good seed planted. The seed of accepting one another, loving, forgiving, being kind one to another. And there could be a new day. Do this work, Lord, for your glory, for our good. Your glorious name.